Hey Optim Answers, Chris here. So, how much can you miss when you go away for a week and a half? Well, Baldur's Gate 3 was released on the day I left, and already phrases like best game of all time are being thrown around. Gen Con also happened while I was gone, and there was a panel where the D&D design team shared the actual goals of the core rulebook revisions. They also revealed that the playtest process for the player's handbook is getting really close to finished. They're basically done with it after playtest 9. And last but not least, the survey results video for playtest 5 came out, and hoo boy, yeah, the main takeaways I got from comments online were overwhelmingly negative, and there were lots of them. So, just quickly, I know Baldur's Gate content is super popular right now. It's getting YouTubers in the community several times their normal view count. Here's where I am with Baldur's Gate. I just started playing. My character is a conjurer wizard with a first level knowledge cleric dip, and I'm enjoying it so far. But if you're a fan of the game, you're weeks ahead of me. If I have any revelations, I'll make a video, but right now, I'm just busy playing catch up. What I want to talk about today is that newest survey results video that's been getting the negative attention. Jeremy Crawford has received significant criticism for several of his comments in the video. Let's go through the ones getting the most attention.
The Barbarian class itself got 77% satisfaction, with most of the features inside the class receiving a score over 80%. And so if you actually averaged the satisfaction of the features themselves, the Barbarian satisfaction is actually over 80%.
Oh, interesting.
We see that sometimes. There's an interesting thing that because people give their overall score for a class before they give their satisfaction for each of the individual elements, we'll see sometimes that people will actually lowball a little bit, but then get into the features and score everything 80% or higher, but they might have said 75% overall satisfaction.
So what he's saying is that some players take the survey and then they give the class a lower score than it probably deserved because they like the individual features of the class more than their score for the overall class would imply. Of course, what's being pointed out in online comments is that there's several reasons why you might score the base class lower than the features. Maybe there's one crappy feature that ruined the class for you. Or maybe there just wasn't enough there. Like, they don't ask your satisfaction of features that are missing. Or maybe you tend to mark features you don't really care about as features you're satisfied with, but they don't add up to a class that you're satisfied with. So Jeremy Crawford is regularly being accused of gaslighting here, as in, we're telling him that we're not satisfied with the class, then he's telling us that actually we are satisfied with it, but we just lowballed our original score. Then there's this bit.
What brought the overall subclass score down was the reliance of Dragon Wings on one of the new sorcerer-specific spells, and the fact that you no longer had your wings out all the time. And the main reason why they're not out all the time is because that feature's level was reduced because in UA 5, we were still using the shared subclass progression that we'd been experimenting with. But as of UA 6, now that we're now in the refinement phase of this process, people know that we have returned to each class having its own subclass progression. So what this means for Draconic Sorcery is that when people next see it, Dragon Wings can go back to being on all the time because that feature is going to go back up to its higher level.
So, some context. First off, permanent Dragon Wings have always been a 14th level feature. So it was never a higher level than the proposed temporary wings in the Playtest 5 version. And secondly, this isn't the first time he's made this mistake on video. So there's speculation in a few comments I read online that he's deliberately trolling the D&D community. And then there's this.
Those sorcerer-specific spells that we introduced, because again, while some people really loved some of them, others got a mixed response. Definitely reflected the mixed feelings in the community about the Warlock going in the playtest from pact magic to spellcasting. So the Wizard actually got a mixed reception, which is fascinating to us because the Wizard is traditionally one of the most popular classes in the game. But some mixed response to some of the new spells we introduced for the Wizard. But then, as expected, people had mixed feelings about the new Twin spell.
Yeah, of course, because, well, Twin spell was very good.
So the criticism here is he's using a code to make things sound more accepted than they actually are. Like if something is soundly rejected in the surveys, he says the response was a mixed response. And finally, this one.
Flex was meant to be the simple option. We wanted to have at least one property for people who just want to increase their damage a bit, and Flex mathematically is actually one of the most powerful of the properties, but we get it. The feedback is, in this new subsystem where we're offering tactical options, people want even a property like Flex to feel like more is going on than just the number went up.
So, to remind my viewers, the Flex Mastery allows the character to use the versatile property die for damage instead of the base weapon damage die when wielding a weapon with one hand. So that would be a D10 in place of a D8, or a D8 in place of a D6. In community discussion, Flex is regularly identified as either the weakest of all the weapon masteries, or at least one of the weakest. But here he's saying, actually, it's among the strongest, and mathematically so. But he doesn't show his work, so this is being called out as even more gaslighting. Now that's all specific stuff, but there was some more general criticism as well. I'm just going to show a couple more clips here for context.
As a result of what we've been seeing in the playtest results, I can preview for people now that in Unearthed Arcana 7, we will be bringing back the 2014 class spell lists.
Okay.
And so because of that, people will see next time the Warlock is in Unearthed Arcana, we will bring Pact Magic back. Is many of the class features in the Warlock that were in 2014 will return to their positions in the next Unearthed Arcana version. So Mystic Arcanum is going to go back to being a core feature. Also, the spellcasting ability selection is not going to survive. The Warlock is going to go back to, just like all other classes, having a single ability that is set in the class as their spellcasting ability.
So I'm going to summarize some of the online comments relating to this. First, they're backing down on a lot of the proposed changes. Like, we got a whole lot of new ideas in these playtests, and now they're backpedaling on more and more as time goes on. And I've seen a number of comments now that the 2024 Player's Handbook is going to end up being essentially the 2014 Player's Handbook with some new art and little enough actual new content that it basically could have been released as an errata, or maybe some optional rules like they did with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, but definitely not substantial enough to warrant a new Player's Handbook. So that's a big one. Also, there's comments that the survey approach to designing the Player's Handbook has turned out to be a massive failure, and probably was doomed from the start, because a role-playing game designed by committee was never going to be any good. So, wowza. That is a lot of negative reactions to a 16.5-minute survey update video. Kind of a disaster, really. And I've been thinking about this stuff since seeing it online, and I wanted to add my own opinions on all these things. So let's start with this one.
We see that sometimes. There's an interesting thing that because people give their overall score for a class before they give their satisfaction for each of the individual elements, we'll see sometimes that people will actually lowball a little bit.
So yeah, this clip comes off pretty badly in my opinion. Though there's some important context he gives later on in the video, but on its own, this is, well, yuck. Like, let's say I give a class a lower rating than most of the features because there's one or two features that ruin it for me. I mean, as one example of why I might score a class lower than the features overall. I'll tell them why in the written feedback, and this was actually the case with the Playtest 6 Cleric, where I figured that divine intervention was a big problem, but most of the cleric features are fine. But here's the thing. I don't think he's sitting on a bunch of written feedback and he's gaslighting us to make it sound like the barbarian was actually more popular than the score suggested, because he regularly shares when comments are critical. Here's an example from the same video.
We view this as it was a good test because for us, the main purpose of all of this is we want to know what people think.
Yeah.
And people let us know.
So when the comments are critical, they do tell us. And I get that the clip doesn't sound good. It's like he has this attitude that written comments be damned. The average feature score is higher, so the lower overall barbarian satisfaction is lower because the initial score was lowballed. And you know what? Mystery solved. Let's move on. But later in the video, and not much later, he says this.
Even though the barbarian scored really well across the board, we always view in a case like this that we still have work to do, because in the written feedback, as much as people might have liked something, people always give us really great suggestions. They identify what are for them pain points. So we'll dig into that and keep refining this class so that it will be in the best form it can be in next year.
So I doubt he's actually gaslighting anyone here. He's given one example of why someone might score a class lower, but then commits to investigating and reading the feedback. Maybe his example isn't as prevalent as he thinks it is, or maybe it is, because, I don't have the written feedback. But presumably, if it isn't, they'll know from the written responses. We know they read the comments. We know they make changes based on those comments. We've seen several examples of it as we go through the playtest process, and I just don't see any reason why this would be the one exception. So in context, I'm guessing here, but I think he's probably mistaken about the frequency of his example. But either way, I think he said the wrong thing here. But the commitment to investigate through written responses to find out what's actually going on is ultimately doing the right thing. And honestly, even if he is completely wrong and there was no lowballing of the initial class score, sounds like it still scored well over their 70% threshold. Moving on. Okay, so this is just flat out wrong. We know that. That's not an opinion. Dragon Wings were a 14th level feature in the 2014 Player's Handbook, and the temporary wings in Playtest 5 were also a 14th level feature. He got it wrong before, and he got it wrong again here. But I don't think he's trolling us. Honestly, I think he just screwed up. He probably misremembered what level that feature was, and then nobody corrected him, and so he's still misremembering. Maybe he's thinking of the flight of the Storm Sorcerer, which doesn't show up until level 18 as part of a bigger feature. He screws up sometimes. And I can't be too harsh because I screw up sometimes too. I misremember something or I read it wrong, and then it ends up in a video. It happens. Yes, he is the lead designer, but there is no way he has every mechanic memorized from the Player's Handbook. Just no way. And here's the silver lining. Ultimately, the issue never was that he got the level of permanent flight wrong. The issue was that the new flight feature was tied to a bad spell, so it became a bad feature. And they're fixing it. So once again, said the wrong thing, but he's ultimately doing the right thing. So let's move on.
But then, as expected, people had mixed feelings about the new twin spell.
Yeah, of course, because, twin spell was very good.
Yes, and as you and I discussed in another video, twin spell has needed to be redesigned for many years. It simply cost too little for how good it was.
Yeah.
The twin spell in this Unearthed Arcana got a 60% score.
So I include that last bit deliberately because the claims that quote-unquote mixed response is misleading only mean that you haven't listened to his guidelines, which he has given us in detail repeatedly, including in this video. 70% approval is the threshold they're looking for. Calling something with a 60% approval a mixed response is entirely fair. Even if it's a 50% approval, that's about as mixed as it can get. Mixed means it's not where it needs to be. And he's not obfuscated that at all. Actually, it's the reverse. If he said that the response to Twin Spell, for example, was that players didn't like it, that would be misleading because apparently most players that filled out the survey were fine with it. If you rewatch that segment on the Hex spell, he doesn't say Hex got a mixed response. He says they wanted to know what people thought, and people let them know. And then Todd and Jeremy break into laughter about how negative the response was. So when the response isn't mixed, and it's just bad, they do tell us. Onwards. So he says here that Flex mathematically was one of the most powerful mash trees. I'd have to say, I would love to see that math. Though, I can't say he's lying. I can't even say definitively he's wrong, because it depends on some assumptions you have to make. Like if you're assuming that the longsword wielder is using the weapon with two hands, but then with weapon mastery wields it one-handed instead and wears a shield, well then Flex is delivering a +2 armor class, which would be really potent. I just wouldn't assume the average longsword user is using the versatile property. On the other hand, if you're just assuming the higher die type, what you can prove mathematically is it does do more damage, regardless of your chance to hit. Not a lot more, but more. Can you prove mathematically that push increases damage? No. You certainly can show how under the right conditions it will, but you can't make a blanket statement that push increases damage because sometimes it won't. Same with topple. You cannot prove mathematically that it increases damage. In fact, depending on the situation, it could potentially even reduce damage if the prone condition is imposing disadvantage on some of your or your allies' attacks. Vex only increases damage if you didn't already have advantage. And if you've been playtesting, you probably know that advantage is pretty common in the playtest. Never mind switching targets and missing and all of that. So although Vex definitely increases damage somewhat, it is really hard to say how much. And I'll tell you this anecdotally. In my experience, it's not nearly as effective as I originally thought it would be. So I guess what I'm getting at is that in my opinion, Flex was too weak. But that's not an objective fact because there are variables and I make assumptions based on my personal experience that might not be universal. Though, to be honest, the damage wasn't even my biggest issue with Flex. My biggest issue with Flex was it made the versatile property irrelevant if you had the Flex mastery for that weapon. So he says here that players want a more tactical feel for Flex than just the number going up. So it probably doesn't matter what their initial math determined about the Flex property. They got the message right, that it was the least popular mastery and that we want a more tactical option. So they'll be addressing that. Good. Said the wrong thing, but ultimately is doing the right thing. And big picture, doing the right thing is what's important. In 2024, if we get a good Flex mastery, nobody's going to care that he thought the discarded version was powerful. So that leaves us with the big one. So for context, he discusses reverting a couple things in this video, but it's compiled with a number of other things that have already been reverted, as well as things in the last playtest we know are going to be reverted as well. So it's not just a couple things that are going back to the 2014 iteration. Here's a non-comprehensive list of examples. They introduced class groups. This seemed to be one of the main ideas for the 2024 Player's Handbook with mages, warriors, priests, and experts. The idea seemed to be that they would standardize some features with all classes within a class group and use that grouping as a qualifier for features or feats. Well, that's gone, and we're back to 2014. They introduced a new method for preparing spells by number of spell slots. This was intended to make it easier for a new player to generate a balanced prepared spells list for their character with appropriate weighting of each spell level. Well, that's gone, and we're back to 2014. I mean, not exactly 2014, but mostly. They introduced 3 main spell lists, Primal, Divine, and Arcane. These were intended to eliminate the need for class-specific spell lists and presumably intended to provide the game a better framework for future expansion of new spells into the game. But that's now gone, and we're back to 2014. They redesigned features and classes and races as well to standardize the need for short and long rests among different characters so parties would be more cohesive in determining when to take rests and what kind of rest was required. Well, that's gone, and it appears we'll have some classes that need regular short rests and others that are only going to need short rests for hit dice expenditure, just like it was in 2014. They introduced a flexible casting ability score for warlocks, addressing the complaint players have had all along that the game seems to have too many charisma-based casters and not enough intelligence-based ones. Well, that's gone, and we're back to 2014. I mean, presumably, he said they were going to a single casting ability score, and my assumption would be they're going back to charisma, though that's not 100% confirmed yet. They introduced Druid wild-shaped templates, eliminating the need for players to shop monster stat blocks, including through the monster manual and other source books, to use a class feature that's central to the class. Now we're back to needing to shop monster stat blocks, just like 2014. Bards have been all over the place in this playtest. Most recently, they could just choose a universal spell list to get their spells from, and eventually use all 3 of them. Well, that's not going to happen anymore, and reaction-based inspiration is back to using a bonus action. So presumably, the Bard after all of that is going to end up looking a lot like it did in 2014. Oh, and last but not least, standardized subclass progression, which ensured every class got subclass features that customize your character at regular intervals. Now, except for the first subclass feature universally being 3rd level, they're all going back to the 2014 versions. So that's a pretty big list, and it's not even comprehensive. Concentration Free Hunter's Mark, Epic Boons, the Ardling, new exhaustion rules, and the list goes on. And that doesn't even count the stuff they haven't reversed yet, but we know is coming. Paladin Smite, it's going to be reverted. We all know it. The Monk, I think we know what kind of feedback they're going to be getting on that. Though let's hope they don't just revert to the 2014 version. There's the Hex spell, and by extension, Hunter's Mark, the Flex Mastery property. So when it comes to backing down on proposed changes, we know there is more yet to come. Now, if you're like me, you're probably disappointed to see some of those changes I listed go away. There's probably others you're glad to see abandoned. But either way, there's simply no denying that they gave us a whole lot of proposed changes, some of them pretty big, and a whole lot of those changes have been abandoned, and it feels like the general theme has been introduce a proposed rules change, report that it got a mixed response, and that the rule will now return to its more familiar form in 2014. And so that's where the comments come from, that the 2024 Player's Handbook isn't going to be significantly different from the 2014 one, and maybe this just could have been errata, or options in a splat book. And I see a number of comments online that maybe the main issue is they haven't given themselves enough time, and maybe they need another year, or maybe 2. And hopefully someone at Wizards will come to the conclusion that they should just push back the Player's Handbook release date. But you know what? I've listed stuff that's been abandoned. Now I'm going to list some stuff that's going to survive. I mean, the substantial stuff, because a lot of small stuff like wording updates, a prepared spells column on class charts, and things like moving ability score bonuses to backgrounds, and stuff like that, it's obviously going to happen, but those kind of things honestly could have been just errata. Here's some of the bigger stuff that is going to be in the 2024 Player's Handbook that isn't in the current game. A 1st level feat with your background. That was apparently very popular, and it looks like it's going to go through. I have to say, I like getting a feat with my background selection. Custom backgrounds being the default option, I think is also a step forward. Speaking of 1st level feats, it looks like separating 1st level and 4th level feats is going to survive. With the redesign of 4th level feats now providing an ability score increase as well, we definitely see those feats are more potent than the 1st level ones, and not available to a 1st level character, even if they're a human or a custom lineage. I like that as well. I was curious if we were going to see higher level feats, like 8th level feats or something. It appears that was never the plan. And on the subject of feats, the 2014 quote-unquote must-have options that pressured weapon users into using hand crossbows and polearms aren't really must-haves anymore. The -5 +10 mechanics have been replaced by mostly once per turn damage boosts, and feats like Shield Master and Mage Slayer and Charger and other feats that were hard passes in 2014 have become much better options, which opens up more character concepts. Now, we've only seen one version of 4th level feats, so I wouldn't be surprised to see more refinement, but it does look like the concept as a whole will survive. This was actually a big one for me, so I'm glad to see it go through, but I'm hoping we'll still see some additional rebalancing, and that goes for 1st level feats as well. It looks like the new design for races are going to go through as well. Now, it's unclear if they're going to be called species or something else, but basically sub-races and variants are gone, and instead there's going to be options within the species themselves for customization. There also seems to be better balancing of species options, thanks, at least in part, to the second pass at the Dragonborn, which was well received. We haven't had survey data on Playtest 6 yet, but from the online reaction I saw, it sounds like some of the bigger changes to Druid Wild Shape, like the Druid using their own hit points and being able to speak while Wild Shaped, are going to make it through. Metamagic redesign and rebalancing for the Sorcerer was apparently well received. Sounds like Twin Spell might be the only metamagic to need more tweaking. Didn't sound to me like the plan was to revert the old Twin Spell, but maybe try to rework the new version into something more accepted by the community. Weapon Mastery is going to be in the 2024 Player's Handbook, and it sounds like a lot of the masteries are going to remain unchanged. Some of them will receive a bit of a tweaking. Crawford specifically mentioned Cleave and Nick in this video, and it sounds like Flex is the only one that's going to be abandoned or completely redesigned. Barbarian Rage redesign, Reckless Attack redesign, Primal Savagery, looks like that's all going through. And the Berserker subclass has had a fix that was massively popular with the community, and that's going to go through as well. I don't know if the Barbarian is going to be great, but I can say confidently now that it will be better. The fighter turning into a saving throw machine at high levels appears to have been popular and should be going through. The fighter's ability to make better use of weapon masteries is also going to be going through, though Weapon Expert and Adept are going to be made more potent. So again, we're getting a better fighter class. We're definitely getting at least 2 new subclasses. As for the redesign of existing subclasses, that was mostly in the last playtest, so we don't know the survey responses yet. But presumably, at least some of them will do well and make it through. And we did see significant redesign on a number of these subclasses. Come on, Trickery Cleric, crossing my fingers. Speaking of which, although apparently the experimental phase of the playtest is over, we are still seeing new proposed changes. Cutting Strike on the Rogue was a brand new idea, and if the online buzz is accurately reflecting the community response, that's going to go through as well. And that's great. Better Rogue. Based on this slide from the Gen Con panel on the revised core rulebooks, it looks like revised spells are on the way. And depending on player response, I would expect to see a lot of the outlier spells look different in 2024. Great. There's a lot of spells out there that are fine, but there are a handful that really could use a redesign. And just by this non-exhaustive list, I do expect that the 2024 Player's Handbook is going to be pretty different than the 2014 one, even though it doesn't appear it's going to be as dramatically different as it potentially could have been. And to me at least, it is going to be improved. We know now to expect 3 more Unearthed Arcana for the Player's Handbook, UA 7, 8, and 9. Todd Kendrick said this.
And also, as people are going to see in UA 7 soon.
Which is very nigh.
Yes.
So, it's possible UA 7 might already be out by the time I post this video, but if it's not, it's coming soon. So what are they going to have in those last 3? Well, we'll get a second pass at Barbarians, Fighters, Warlocks, Wizards, and Sorcerers, as well as a full subclass list for each of them, maybe as early as Playtest 7. Spell redesign, well, that'll be in either 7 or 8, and maybe both 7 and 8. We'll definitely get a revised Monk, my guess, in Playtest 8. We'll see revised weapon masteries. That could be any time. They'll have to make another pass at the Bard that doesn't rely on universal spell lists, and that kind of has to be in 7, right? And probably some of the miscellaneous bits and pieces, which will probably be in Playtest 9. And that's really it. I mean, do they actually need more time? It depends what you wanted. If you wanted 6th edition, then they need a lot more time. That's not what they wanted, though. They've been really clear in this survey video, as well as in the Gen Con panel, what the main design goal for the new Player's Handbook was. They did a survey in 2021, and it was a big one. I did it. It took a long time. It asked for player feedback on the 2014 Player's Handbook. It went through everything: feats, classes, subclasses, spells, and then they asked for satisfaction on all of these things. They compiled the data to get a percentage of satisfaction for everything in the 2014 Player's Handbook. Jeremy Crawford had this to say about satisfaction ratings.
One of our big goals for this process is to take things that were viewed as unsatisfactory in the 2014 Player's Handbook and make them satisfactory.
The Gen Con presentation reiterated the same thing. Get stuff below 70%, over 70%. So presumably, if something scores 70% or higher in the 2021 survey, it didn't even necessarily need redesign according to their own stated goal. Jeremy Crawford actually told us about this really early on. This clip is from the very first survey results video released in November of last year.
70% or higher is what we're looking for. When something scores in the 70s, we see that as the community giving a thumbs up, but that also means there's still some tinkering for us to do. Sometimes very minor tinkering or moderate tinkering. But the core message is the community is saying, yes, more of this. As soon as a score hits 80% or higher, now we're going into the realm of not only does the community want more of that, but they want exactly that. So what that means for us as a design team is when we look at a thing that gets 80% satisfaction or higher, we then tread very carefully in our further development to make sure we don't change it too much. It might still be changed in minor ways for balance reasons, for cohesion reasons, making sure the different parts of the game are functioning well together. But as soon as you're into that 80% area, or even more especially if you make it into the 90s, that is basically the community saying, yes, this. Now, when we go below 70, when we're in the 60s, something in the 60s we consider to be salvageable, that there are enough people interested in the thing that maybe there's something there for us to save, but we need to really reconsider many aspects of the design. Anything that scores below 60%, like when we're in the 50s, good chance we're not going to do anything with it. And if it's in the 40s and below, it's pretty much gone.
So I guess they kind of let us know the goal a long time ago, but it's been made much more clear in the past couple weeks. 69% or lower needs changing. 70% to 79%, tweak it a bit and see if they can get it even higher, but ultimately it's a thumbs up. And 80% or higher, minimal changes, if any. So they did the 2021 Player's Handbook survey, and anything with an 80% or higher satisfaction, they were never going to change significantly unless they needed to for balance reasons or something like that. Anything 70% or higher, they would play around with to see if they could get it higher yet. But if the redesign was less popular than the original, then they would revert. And only the stuff below 70% was going to be the real focus of the playtest. Get that stuff up to 70% at least. And if they succeed on that, then they've met their design goal. So we kind of have to guess what scored below 70% in that 2021 survey. I think we can make some reasonable guesses, but we do know some of it scored really bad. I mean, really bad. 29% for the Berserker subclass. The new version, 84%. 54% for the Champion, now 74%. The Ranger, 27%, now 83%. I gotta think that's the previous playtest Ranger, not the most current one. So that could change after the Unearthed Arcana 6 survey. So I expect we're not done with the Ranger. Hunter went from 64% to 71%, and Sorcerer from 60% to 72%. Now, there's no way that these particular examples were randomly selected. They're showing the successes, not the failures. Like we know the first Druid scored low. I don't know how low, but let's just say it wasn't a mixed response. But then they threw a redesign in UA6, and I bet that scores over 70%. Now, I don't think they're going to reach 70% plus for everything, but I'm not sure that's even possible. Some things are just always going to have a community divide. And when you do need to rebalance things, especially if that rebalancing involves making something less powerful, you're just never going to get that kind of agreement from the community that taking away their ultra powerful option is a good thing. But this goal being revealed, and I guess it was discussed all along, but now that they've been clear about it, it makes me understand a lot of the decisions to revert some things a whole lot more. Like, if universal spell lists scored lower than class spell lists, and those class spell lists scored 70% or higher, then of course they're just going to go back. There's no point in making a change unless it's more popular than the original. That would just be a change for the sake of change. Which brings us back to this game design by survey thing. Was this doomed to failure right from the start? We're going to get a player's handbook that has significant changes and likely greater player satisfaction than the 2014 one, but it isn't going to feel like a new edition. And with this approach to the design, there was never any chance it would have. This isn't game design by committee. The game is already designed. This is game refinement by committee. You're always going to have a significant percentage of the player base that are resistant to the big changes. So, does that mean this is a failure? Maybe. I doubt it is from their perspective. 5th edition is the best-selling and most played tabletop role-playing game of all time. A goal of updating the game by simply addressing the less popular stuff without completely redesigning it from the ground up is pretty understandable. If you don't like 5th edition D&D, well then you're not going to like the 2024 Player's Handbook, and you'll consider the revision a failure for sure. But understand that a lot of people love 5th edition, and a lot of those people might be receptive to an improved Berserker subclass and some feat rebalancing, but they weren't necessarily up for an entirely different game. And I can only give you my own opinion. Personally, I was up for a new edition. New rules, new options, a 6th edition that was based on 5th, but felt very different because I like new toys to play with. I was okay if the 2024 Player's Handbook wasn't backwards compatible. However, I also love 5th edition. If I didn't, this channel wouldn't exist. And I'm glad to see some patches for the rough stuff. So although this 2024 Player's Handbook isn't going to be quite what I hoped for, I do expect it to be an improvement over the 2014 one. So I'll take it. Whether it's worth the money for you, well, that needs to be your decision. But yeah, for a 16-minute video, we definitely found out a lot. And part of me wishes I had not been away, so I could have reacted right away. Then again, on the other hand, I had more time to consider this stuff, and I was able to present a more thought-out reaction with opinions that, for me, are more settled, which I hope you found engaging whether you agree with me or not. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you again soon. This channel and its content are supported by the patrons on Patreon. These are my top-level patrons I want to call out today. We have Airhead and Alex R., Vo, Bloody Nine, Atherazone, CJ, Chris C., Clement Brunette, Coral, Dank Train, Dewey Cheatham and Howe, Douglas Reynolds, Eden the DM, Eric Wasserman, FBK05, Gish Schleif, Lightfoot, Heisenberger, Jay Gemmel, James Makla, James Sprague, Jean-Baptiste Blanchette, Jiriru, John Matera, Jonathan Zucker, Joseph Van Horn, Justin Times, Lars V, Mark D, Math Guy Dave, Mr. Brett, PCZ, Quicksilver HG80, Ramen Goblin, Scott Parsons, Sig, Speed Shadow, Thunderlock, Balazil, and William Whittles. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all my patrons and anyone interested in joining my Patreon. Link is in the video description.